Good morning and welcome to Sunday School. I'm glad that you've joined in today. I think we have this Sunday and one more lesson from Isaiah, and then we'll be going to Luke for the next quarter. I've been inviting you to come to in-person Sunday School, but for the next 2 weeks, at least the next 2 weeks, we will be reverting to all online for Sunday school and worship. COVID seems to have crept in among us, and we're going to try to do everything we can to keep everybody safe. When we have these kinds of interruptions and inconveniences, it's really easy for us to just drop out of church. I kind of like listening to it online, and it makes it convenient for me. But with our technology, we still have the ability to worship together, and for that we need to be very appreciative, and we need to also be thankful that our pastor has a mindset for the incorporation of technology, because a few years ago, without cell phones and Wi-Fi and internet more widespread, we would just be completely cut off. But even in these times, we can still worship together. Now, we're coming from Isaiah chapter 58 today. In this lesson, through Isaiah, the Lord is calling into question the religious practices, activities, and rituals of the people of Israel. Their practices and the things that they did appeared to be exactly what God required of his people, but everything they did was an act of hypocrisy in the eyes of God. And as we study through these scriptures for today, we might want to self-analyze our own religious practices for signs of spurts of insincerity or hypocrisy. So our first verses come from chapter 58, verses 1 through 2. Cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and forsook not the ordinance of their God. They ask of me the ordinance of justice. They take delight in approaching to God. God's given Isaiah some words to say to Israel. A lot of times that we've been studying, he was speaking to the tribes of Judah, that section. But now when he says the house of Jacob, he's referring to all of Israel, like the nation was before they were divided between the northern and the southern tribes. But God has not only given Isaiah the words to say, he's telling him exactly how to say the words. He said, he said, cry out loudly like a trumpet. Now, the word trumpet here is referring to a ram's horn that was blown to designate danger to the nation. It was a distinctive sound that the people could easily recognize, and it was not to be ignored. It may be a little like our severe weather warnings that we get on our phones and our TV, and when you hear them, you take notice because you know it's for your own safety to pay attention. Well, Isaiah was going to speak loudly, and he was also not to hold back or sugarcoat this message. He was supposed to speak it just like it was. The people were in danger, and they needed to heed this warning. The terms sins and transgressions indicated they had a willful defiance of God's way. Not that they didn't know his way, but they had a purposeful rebellion against God. But in verse 2, it seems almost like a contrast, and it looks like Israel's doing everything exactly right. It says they seek God daily, and they delight to know his ways. And if you see this blind behind me moving, I'm babysitting a 4-legged grandchild this weekend, and she likes to be wherever I am. So just ignore if you see it move. So they were seeking God daily, and they were delighted to know his ways, so it seemed. And that's what we should do, right? I mean, we should seek God to guide us daily and to try to learn his way for direction in our lives. They even prayed for righteous judgment, or the ability to make just decisions. You might have prayed for that before, for God to guide you in a decision that you have to make. And so we might ask, well, what was the problem? If they did all these things, it says in verse 2, what was wrong? But there was a bit of sarcasm in these words. Without hearing the speaker and the tone that was used, it's harder to recognize it. And we can relate to that, with our conversations that we have using texts and emails. The person that you're sending a message to can't hear the way that you're saying it, and that a lot of times indicates a lot. Israel did all the religious acts when they were supposed to do it, how they were supposed to do it, but their everyday life practices revealed that there was a different picture about the condition of their heart. And in verses 3 through 5, God became a little bit more specific about what was missing in their lives. Wherefore have we fasted, say they, and thou seest not? Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and thou takest no knowledge? Behold, in the day of your fast ye find pleasure, and exact all your labors. Behold, you fast for strife and debate, and to smite with the fists of wickedness. You shall not fast as you do this day. In other words, your fasting has got to change. To make your voice to be heard on high, it's got to be changed. Is it such a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Wilt thou call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? Fasting was and still is a spiritual discipline for the purpose of helping people to humble themselves before the Lord, to seek his presence and to focus on his purpose and not their own. It's usually done without food, but there are lots of ways that we could fast to have time to seek God. We may need to fast from social media or sports or activities that rob our time and sincere faithfulness to God. The Israelites complained that they had fasted and God didn't even take notice of that pious action. They were very self-righteous, and God was not seeing all that they were doing. That was their complaint. And we may have been offended. We could know how they feel. In our lives, there may have been a time that we worked really hard to fulfill a task for a loved one or a boss, and they didn't even seem to notice all the effort that we had put in to trying to do exactly what they asked to do. So the problem here wasn't that God didn't see it. He did see their fasting and their religious activities, but what he saw was more than they knew. He saw their hearts, and he was not pleased. In the pagan religions of the countries that surrounded Israel, they thought that if they did their religious acts or rituals that were required by their pagan god, that it would produce a favorable response from their God. And if the God didn't respond favorably or didn't answer their request, then it meant that the ritual that they did was done incorrectly. Well, these beliefs had slowly crept into Israel, and they believed God to be on that same level like the pagan God. So they believed, well, we've been fasting and we've been doing the things that you required, but you're not blessing us, so we must be doing it wrong. And he pointed out here exactly what was wrong. They had actually come to see fasting as some sort of magical ritual that would make God perform what they wanted. And it was all done the way they were doing it with a selfish motive. Their hearts were selfish. They were doing it because they expected God to bless them or to respond to them in a positive manner. Not only were they seeking selfish desires, they were mistreating other members of their society. There was a major disconnect between the fasting they did and the behavior they exhibited toward others. In verses 6 through 7, God explained what was required of the fasting, the kind that he would honor. Is not this fast that I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke. Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh. The description of acceptable fasting given in these verses has more to do with behavior of the person than the act of doing without food. And there were 4 actions that God wanted. And if you pay attention, you'll see that as each action was listed, it became just a little bit more persistent. The first one was to loose the bands or the chains of wickedness. In other words, remove the bands of oppression to the less fortunate. Instead of those that were fasting oppressing others, they should be involved in uplifting others. And a sinful person who has some power is tempted to take advantage of others who have little or no power. We see it in our world today. And the second part was to undo the heavy burdens or the ropes of the yoke. Oxen or domestic animals were bound together with a wooden yoke so that they could plow or pull heavy loads. And if the ropes that held them together were too tight, the animals suffered. Now, the burdens, of course, are conditions that keep people in depression and or oppression. And God told them, treat all these people the same, carry the yoke evenly, and loosen the burdens that hold some tighter in oppression. Help lift the burden instead of having someone else carry the load. And the next one was to set the oppressed free. This indicates enslavement or wrongful imprisonment. Some of the oppressed people were there because of the ones doing the fasting. Israelites had been enslaved themselves by Egypt, and some had been taken away to Babylon already. And the Lord had set them free from Egypt and would set them free from their exile in Babylon. In order for him to hear the petitions of those that were fasting, in order for him to hear our prayers, then it was necessary that they would hear the petitions of the ones who were being oppressed in their society. And then the last one was break every yoke, not loosen it, break it, break every yoke. Don't just loosen the burden of oppression, release it entirely. Remove any elements that hold people in a persecuted situation. We need to do that individually, and we need to do that collectively as a group of believers and as a nation. Verse 7 clarifies the purpose of fasting. Instead of doing without food to impress God or others around, because they did not fast and not let it be known publicly. And I was reading somewhere else that if you fast, then do it privately. Don't whine and complain that's what you're doing. But he said, instead of trying to impress God with doing without food, feed the hungry and make sure basic needs are being met for everyone, such as shelter and clothing. In a nutshell, care for one another and each other. Each of us should pray that our eyes can see the needs of people around us. Sometimes we see and we ignore. Sometimes we don't see. It might be people in our own family and it may be neighbors, but we should pray that we're able to see when others have a genuine need and to guide us in ways that we can help to meet those needs, whether it's physical needs or spiritual needs. Verses 8 through 10 describe the kind of blessings that you could expect when genuine worship becomes a part of your life. So we're going to read verses 8 through 10. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thine health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Thou shalt cry, and he shall say, Here I am. If thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger and speaking vanity, and if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. God was not interested in worship that consisted of just going through the motions. Now, sometimes we might just go through the motions. We attend church on Sunday morning, we go Sunday night, we go Wednesday night, we participate in this activity, we participate in that activity. and our mind, our heart may not be in it fully. He was not interested in that kind of worship. If there was a true repentance that resulted in turning away from oppressing others, then the people would experience 4 changes in their lives, as indicated in these verses. First of all, they would become a light to guide others. Their own paths would become crystal clear, and God's character would be able to shine through them toward others. And their relationship with God would be restored and healed. And he said, not only would it be restored and healed, it said, it shall spring forth speedily. God's presence would go before them as they traveled along life's journey, and it would also become their rear guard. And that was a term used to indicate an army given protection from behind. They could relate to God going before because of their travels from Egypt, and also protecting from the rear because of the guidance that they received with a cloud and a pillar of fire as they traveled from Egypt to the promised land. Now, he said when their attitudes and hearts changed, God would answer them when they called. He said, the Lord shall answer, thou shalt cry, and he shall say, here I am. They had complained that God did not respond to their fasting. But with a change of heart, they would no longer be seeking God for selfish reasons. They would want, and they would receive a genuine fellowship with him. Instead of trying to impress God by starving themselves, they would demonstrate their love for God by feeding the hungry and showing care for the destitute. Now, our last verses today are verses 11 through 12, and it reads, and the Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones, and thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. They shall raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. Isaiah continued with the types of blessings that God would bring to his people. He would always lead and guide them. They would never have to question whether or not he was with them. He didn't promise that their lives would be exempt of troubles. We don't have that promise either. But what he did promise was that he would give them sufficient help to endure whatever may come their way. And Isaiah used 2 examples of water to show the care that's promised by God. Because they lived in a dry climate, a semi-arid climate, they understood the importance of a water source. God assured them that his redeemed would be refreshed like a watered garden. I know some of you may grow some flowers that tell you exactly when they need water. I like that kind. They appear wilted. You give them water, and then they get revived, and they look robust and pretty soon after that. They would also receive unending spiritual nourishment, like a spring of water that never runs dry. And through the analogy of water, God was promising the unending gift of life to them. To have the water sources, it meant life or death if they didn't have it. They would know exile and they would know destruction of Jerusalem, but God promised that a remnant would be a part of the restoration and the restoration of foundations laid long ago. There would be a restoration of physical foundations and spiritual foundations. Adam and Eve were cut off from access to God when they were cast out of Eden. And when God gave the promised land to the descendants of Abraham, these descendants that he's speaking to right now, that was a sign toward restoration of what was lost in the Garden of Eden. But their unfaithfulness in this promised land had created another separation from God. However, with repentance and redemption, God would work with and through his people once again to return them to Israel from their exile and to restore what they had destroyed in their unfaithfulness. In time, they would be known as the repairer of walls and the restorer of streets. You know, as believers, we should be known as the peacemakers. And he said they would be known as that. With God's blessings, they would embrace the covenant life that he had created with them in all of its fullness when he promised them many years ago that he would be their God and they would be his people. Now, in reflection of today's lesson and our religious activities, we may need to ask if we're bargaining with God. Are we thinking that because of what we do at church or our participation in church or the activities that we're in, is it because of true faithfulness in worship to God, or are we doing it out of habit? Are we going through the motions, or are we doing it for selfish reasons? Are we expecting a blessing in return? Are we thankful to God, or are we going through motions so that God will bless us? Are we more excited to impress God and see how he will repay us for our efforts, or do we want to help others in the love of God, expecting nothing in return but to share God's love? I want to thank you for joining in again today. However you plan to celebrate Thanksgiving this week, whether it's a small group or a large group, or with your family or without your family, I pray that you and your family members will be safe. And we need to all make sure that we are adhering to the CDC guidelines and praying for our own and for our country. And I thank you for listening today, and I hope that you'll join again next time. Thank you.